Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Ray. With the two Lewises walking down the aisle, I almost felt like we should be doing that graduation walk, you know, where you've got that one foot steadily going on. For a guy from Harvard University who hasn't done bad in life, I suppose I would just be like another big day at the office. How about a round of applause for all of you and for our friends at Cable who are making this evening possible tonight. Thank you so much. We're very pleased to have this distinguished author and student of world affairs, I must add, because to write the kind of stuff that you write about, you have to be a student of world affairs and to give some thought about what is really happening. We know that your career goes all the way back to the Washington Daily News, and you've worked at a number of other newspapers. For most of you who haven't read all of his stuff, it is here in the handout. You wrote another book some 40 years ago that was called Gideon's Trumpet. And 40 years later, you've taken, after a 17-year, basically an absence, you came back and decided to write again. How did the idea for freedom, the biography of the First Amendment, how did the idea germinate? Where did it come from, and how did you get started on this project?
I'm afraid it's going to be a long answer.
Well, we have a little time.
Because it's a very good question. In a sense, the book is a recapitulation of my life as a journalist. I've spent, not all of it, but very much of it, writing about the law and, in particular, the First Amendment, or free speech and freedom of the press under the Constitution. And I needed to be, first of all, I might tell you something about how far back it goes, and then I'll come to the present. I covered the Supreme Court for the New York Times. That's one of the things I did long ago. And one day I was invited in for a chat by Justice Felix Frankfurter. I assure you it was only a chat. No secrets were imparted. I never got any secrets from Supreme Court justices. They were very reliably non-secret. They didn't talk, let's put it that way. But this was a chat. And that day, Justice Frankfurter was feeling irritable because somebody, I think in a newspaper, had called him insufficiently liberal. And he was feeling grumpy about that. And he suddenly rose, he said something about it, and then he suddenly rose up from behind his desk and said, "Liberal, I'll show you liberal." He walked across the room. The opposite wall from his desk was a wall of shelves with copies of the United States reports, the collections of Supreme Court opinions. He unerringly went to one, pulled it out, opened it up, handed it to me, and said, "Read." Well, I read, sitting there. What he had handed me, what the book was open to, was a dissenting opinion by Justice Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. This was an opinion from 1929, and the case was called United States against Schwimmer. Rosika Schwimmer was an immigrant from Hungary. She wanted to become a United States citizen. She loved the United States, but she was not allowed to because she was a pacifist, and she wouldn't take the oath which required her to say that she would take up arms to defend the Constitution. She wouldn't say that because she was a pacifist. She sued and lost, and the case went to the Supreme Court, where she lost again by a narrow vote, and Justice Holmes dissented on her side. He began by saying, in a rather sardonic, Holmesian way, he rather doubted that she would be asked to take up arms because she was a woman of a certain age. Well, he put that aside and said, "I don't agree with Ms. Schwimmer about war and pacifism. I know that war is terrible," and indeed he did know because he'd fought in the Civil War. Mind you, this was 1929. He was 88 years old. And he'd fought in the Civil War, been wounded gravely 3 times. Probably his life was saved because his father, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., doctor and poet, came down from Massachusetts to Virginia, a long trip in those days, to treat him. He said, "But I think it's not just terrible. It has noble qualities, so I don't agree with her. But if there is any provision of the Constitution that more compellingly requires attachment than any other, it is freedom of thought. Not freedom for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate." And that's the title of the book. So he gave me the title, but he didn't stop there. There's a concluding sentence or two which are quite remarkable. He said, recurring to the opinion that bars this applicant's way, the Quakers, pacifists, have done their part in making this country what it is. And I had not thought before now that we regretted our inability to expel them because they believe more than some of us in the Sermon on the Mount. That's the end of the opinion. And I read it sitting there, and as I read those words, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I tell you, there's no other judge, in my opinion, then or ever in any country who could have written that sentence, because they believe more than some of us in the Sermon on the Mount.
But as we begin to look back at one of the other key focal points in your book, is that it's about 14 words that are some of the most important words in our Constitution, and 14 words that mean so much to us today.
Actually, in the amendment, one of the first set of amendments to pass after the Constitution was adopted, the Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments, and the First Amendment contains a number of clauses, but the ones that the book is about and that we're talking about tonight are the speech and press clauses. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. It sounds very simple. It sounds, as Holmes called it, a sweeping command. But the interesting thing is, ladies and gentlemen, from 1791, when that amendment was added to the Constitution, no one claiming the right to freedom of speech or press under the amendment won a case in the Supreme Court until 1931, 140 years after the amendment was adopted, and 2 years after the Schwimmer case was decided, so she lost. And fortunately, then began 60 years of courts enforcing the amendment in a very creative and sweeping way that have given us immense freedom to say unpopular things, nasty things, rancid things, to print what we want even though the government doesn't want us to print it. It's made us free, and that we owe to the courts that have latterly, since 1931, interpreted the amendment.
But between 1791 and 1931, we're talking about a document that took on a life of its own. It's also a living and breathing document. It has not been confined in a particular period or confined to just usage by a certain group of people.
That's right. But let me tell you what happened in 1931, as you'll see, that Mr. Lewis is correct in what he's just said. The first case that was ever won by a claimant for free speech was a case about a woman who walked down a street in California carrying a red flag. Now, you may be surprised to know that California in those days had a law that made it a crime to carry a red flag down the street. The red flag was seen as a symbol of radicalism, and she was prosecuted and convicted for carrying the red flag. And the Supreme Court reversed her conviction, said she had a right to speak. Now notice that this was a speech case in which no words were spoken. It was symbolic speech. And that has become one of the headings of the way the Supreme Court has given meaning to the First Amendment. You know that a few years ago, now more than a few, the Supreme Court held that a person who burned the flag, the United States flag, as a political protest was protected by the First Amendment. Again, symbolic speech. I happened to be in the courtroom the day the court announced its decision in that case, and I'll never forget, Chief Justice Rehnquist dissented, and his dissent began, and he read it out loud, very unusually. His dissent began with the poem Barbara Frietchie. I don't know if they still read that in school, I doubt it. But the poem begins, "Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag," she said.
So again, as we look at the history of these 14 words, every word is important, and as they were written, no one had any idea in terms of how the applications of those 14 words would be applied against situations and circumstances today.
No, they really didn't. The principal author of the amendment, James Madison, did have a general point of view. He was really an all-out believer in free speech. He thought people should be allowed to say what they wanted, and the answer to anything incorrect or nasty or unfortunate was for somebody to speak back. As Justice Brandeis said many years later, the answer to bad speech is more speech, good speech. Well, that hasn't been the rule through much of our history, but it was Madison's belief, and it's been given concrete form by our courts.
As we look at our laws and our common law, we seem to have more freedom than any other country in the world. Is it because of the evolution of these 14 words that give us that, or is us as a society?
I think it's some of both. It's an outspoken country. It has been from the beginning, even when the courts were not enforcing it. Now, you have to understand one thing. It's a little hard for us to understand because it's so alien to our view today. At the beginning, a lot of people thought the words of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, were not to be taken as law to be enforced by the courts, but were just an admonition to Congress. Congress, don't do this, like a sign. And when Congress in 1798 passed a statute, the Sedition Act, that made it a crime to criticize the president, you might think that was in violation of the First Amendment. And you might be right. You are right. But Madison and Jefferson, who fought that law, didn't sue as we would today. They went after it politically, and that was the difference at the time. And Jefferson ran for president. He ran in part against the Sedition Act. He won, and he pardoned all the editors who'd been convicted under the Sedition Act.
When you're looking at the history of these 14 words and the First Amendment, it's inescapable, the involvement and the weight and the thought process in the presence of judges. These 14 words have been interpreted over and over and over again. This document continues to breathe. And you, throughout your book, you continually refer to how judges thought about the 14th Amendment. 14 words, right? First Amendment.
Well, I'll tell you, the book is really stories. I've always thought about law as stories because...
Can everybody hear okay all the way in the back? Good. Okay, so... Okay. Can you talk a little louder?
Oh, okay. I can talk into the microphone. Is that
No,
better?
No, just speak a little louder if you can.
Oh, okay. Yes, because law from the beginning in our system, the Anglo-American system, has been stories. Originally, the law developed in courts in England when one man's cow wandered into the neighbor's pasture and the neighbor sued, and the judge had to make up a rule to fit that case. They're all little stories, and that's the way I think of these cases. And let me tell you another story about a case that was decided by the Supreme Court in the same year as the red flag case, the flag about the woman who was named Yetta Stromberg. I didn't tell you that. But the same year, there was the first press case. And it was a great case, a case that's had fundamental effects on the freedom of the press. It's called Neer against Minnesota. Neer, Mr. Neer, J.M. Neer, published a weekly newspaper called the Saturday Press in Minneapolis. It was a nasty paper, malicious, scandalous, and viciously anti-Semitic. Not a nice thing. Minnesota had an unusual law that allowed judges to suppress newspapers that were malicious, and a judge suppressed the Saturday Press. The main newspapers of Minnesota, the established newspapers, didn't care. They didn't like Mr. Neer. They didn't bleed for his suppression. They just ignored it. But the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, Robert Rutherford McCormick, thought it was a threat. He heard about the case, and he sent his great lawyer, Weymouth Kirkland, up to Minneapolis to take over the case for Mr. Neer. And Kirkland took the case to the Supreme Court of the United States. And he won. And the court said that what had happened to Mr. Neer, the suppression of his paper before future issues were published, which was called previous restraint by the author of the opinion, Chief Justice Hughes, we call it prior restraint now, was the worst kind of suppression. So he virtually ruled out prior restraint. Now you may think to yourself, why do we care about a rotten sheet called the Saturday Press, vicious, scandalous, malicious? Why should we care about its suppression? Well, that's another story. I'll go from one story to another. How many of you have seen the movie Good Night and Good Luck? A few. About Ed Murrow. Ed Murrow's producer was Fred Friendly. Fred Friendly is played in the movie by George Clooney. I want to tell you that the real Fred Friendly did not look a bit like George Clooney. Not a bit. Well, Fred, after he quit CBS in a tangle of recriminations, and he became vice president of the Ford Foundation. And one day he was sitting at lunch at the Ford Foundation, and he was telling his colleagues at the lunch table that he had decided to write a book about the Near case, which I've just mentioned to you. And from another table, Irving Shapiro, who was then the chairman of the DuPont Company, came over and said, "Fred, did I hear you say that you're writing a book about the Near case?" "Yes." "I knew Mr. Near." "You knew Mr. Near?" "I did. My father had a small dry cleaning store in Minneapolis. And one day, gangsters came to the store and told my father that he had to pay them protection money, and he refused to do so. I heard all this. I was standing in the back of the store. I was 10 years old. And when he wouldn't pay, they threw acid on the clothes, doing thousands of dollars worth of damage. The regular newspapers of Minnesota did not write a word about this incident. But Mr. Near came around, interviewed Mr. Shapiro, wrote a story. The gangsters were prosecuted and convicted. So you never know about the risk that comes from suppressing even bad newspapers. There's something worth saving in the worst.
But there were other papers that were also suppressed. I want to go back to something called the Pentagon Papers, and things that happened during the tenure of President Richard Nixon during the Vietnam War. There were draconian battles over keeping executive privilege and who should have the right to see what kind of papers. And the courts played a mighty role in finally deciding what the public had a right to know.
Great case. In some ways, the most remarkable case. 1971, the New York Times began publishing lengthy excerpts from, 12 pages of the newspaper, and articles about a secret official history of the Vietnam War. This was a long history, 47 volumes, 47 volumes. Every page stamped top secret. A New York Times reporter had acquired 44 of the volumes. His source did not give him 3 volumes that had to do with diplomatic negotiations with North Vietnam. And there was a great deal of uncertainty on the paper about whether we should publish. The publisher, Arthur O. Sulzberger, Punch Sulzberger, was a former United States Marine, very patriotic. It wasn't the habit of the New York Times to publish secret documents, and he was in great doubt about it. But in the end, he decided to publish. The day he decided to publish, he flew to London for a long-planned trip. This is a little personal anecdote I'll throw in here. I was then the London correspondent of the New York Times, and my wife and I had dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Sulzberger at the Savoy Hotel. And that was the evening of the first day of publication. And the maître d' of the restaurant kept coming over and saying, "Mr. Sulzberger, there's a transatlantic telephone call for you." That was a big deal in those days. You didn't have many transatlantic phone calls. It was really a big deal. And while he was away from the table, Mrs. Sulzberger said to us, "They're going to put Arthur in prison. I just know it." And she really believed it, I'll tell you. But they didn't put him in prison. At least they didn't try just yet. What they did was to try to stop the paper from continuing to publish, exactly the Near case. But the Near case, while it frowned on prior restraint, had a clause in there, an exception that Chief Justice Hughes put into his opinion, saying you could have prior restraint to stop the publication of the sailing dates of troop ships in time of war.
Yeah.
And the government sued for a prior restraint, a restraining order, saying this case was like Chief Justice Hughes's troop ships, exactly the same. Well, I have another little story to interrupt my story. I told you before, Mr. Lewis, I'm not a short talker. That the day, it was a Tuesday in June 1971, a new federal judge in Manhattan took his seat for the first time. Murray Gerfine. He came into the courthouse, he went to the clerk's office, and he said to the clerk, I'm Murray Gerfine, I'm the new judge, and I'd like you to show me what to do. And they said, well, welcome, Judge, we're glad to have you there. I'll take you to your courtroom in a moment, but let's first see what case you have to decide. And he pointed to a large wheel. He said, you see, we have this wheel and little pieces of paper with the names of cases, and we spin it, and one of the pieces of paper will come out, and that's your case. So he spun it, and the piece of paper came out, and he opened it, and he said, Judge, your case is called United States against New York Times. First day on the bench, he's got the Pentagon Papers case. Amazing. Well, Judge Gerfine was very good. He behaved like a judge his first day on the bench. The government came in there, into his courtroom. They closed the doors of the courtroom and had a secret session in which 3 people from the New York Times were allowed to stay. And the government had on a library card, I suppose you have them in this library too. By the way, I love public libraries, and I think this one is wonderful. But they had 44 volumes, or 47 volumes even, of the Pentagon Papers wheeled in on a library court with 2 soldiers with weapons, presumably to impress the judge with how secret it all was. And the judge said, well, where's the secret? What's so secret in there? And the United States attorney said, oh, no, we're not going to tell you that, Judge. You've got to read them and decide yourself. 47 volumes. And the judge said, no, that's not the way I'm going to do it. You got to point to something that's menacing, that's really going to undo the country. And the government was very loath to do that, but the judge held fast. And that made the difference. The burden of proof made the difference. Was the government just going to have to sit there and forever while the judge read these 47 volumes, or was it going to have to point to something? Well, he said they had to point. They tried. They called a couple of witnesses from the Pentagon, and he was unpersuaded, and he decided that the New York Times could resume publishing. He was stopped by an appeals court, and the case went back and forth for just 2 weeks. 2 weeks from the day the case began, it was very fast, through all the levels of the federal courts, the Supreme Court decided the case. And the Supreme Court decided, by a vote of 6-3, that the New York Times could resume publishing. Now, there are 9 justices of the Supreme Court, but there were 10 opinions. It was slightly confusing. There was one opinion for the court, unsigned, which simply said, this is a prior restraint. It didn't meet the test of emergency, and so the government loses. And then each member of the court had a separate opinion, either agreeing or dissenting. I'd like to read one little bit from a concurring opinion, agreeing with the result, by Justice Hugo Black, that I think says a lot about the First Amendment. Sorry, I've got pieces of paper here.
That's all right, and just try to make sure that they can hear you in the back of the room, if you would.
Okay.
Okay.
This deserves to be read aloud, so I'll read it loud. Justice Black. Justice Black had been on the court a long time, 30-some years. He was the first Roosevelt appointee in 1937. Before that, he'd been a senator from Alabama for 2 terms. And he was a great believer in the First Amendment. This was the last opinion he ever wrote. He became ill that summer. This was June 1971. He became ill and died that summer. His last opinion. This is what he said. The press was protected in the First Amendment so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. And paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people and sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. It's rather an old-fashioned sentence, to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell, but it's pretty powerful, isn't
But the applications of that speak to exactly what's happening today in the minds of many.
You noticed.
Yes.
Yes, it is. That's why I read it, because it shows you It shows you, it's not only the reason I read it, it's not the only reason. I read it because it's powerful language. But it shows you the timelessness of these issues. People write something, a judge writes something in a case about X. 5 or 10 or 20, or in this case, Near against Minnesota, Pentagon Papers, 40 years. 40 years. 40 years later, in a completely different circumstance, in a world that Chief Justice Hughes couldn't have imagined in 1931, it becomes the basis of the decision. I want to tell you one other thing about that case. May I?
Sure, please.
This is about how to win cases in the Supreme Court. There were 4 members of the Supreme Court when the Pentagon Papers case was decided who were really very strong believers in the First Amendment and were probably going to be deciding the case in favor of the New York Times. The lawyers knew that before they argued the case. The New York Times lawyer was a Yale law professor named Alexander Bickel. And he had to win at least 1 more, and better than that, 2 more, of the remaining judges in order to win his case. 4 was not enough. And so he had to do something, make a less than absolute construction of the First Amendment. He had to reassure some of the members of that court that he was not asking them to give the New York Times carte blanche to publish nuclear secrets or something really dreadful. And a moment came in his argument when Justice Potter Stewart said this to him: Mr. Bickel, suppose that when we go back to our chambers and look at the secret material, because they were given secret briefs, the justices, we find something that convinces us that if it were published, it would lead to the death of 100 young men whose only fault was that they had low draft numbers, which is why they were in Vietnam. Do you say that the First Amendment prevails and we have to let those 100 young men be executed? And Professor Bickel said, Your Honor, I wish there were a statute that covered this situation, because he'd been arguing that all along. There was no, Congress had not spelled out what to do. And Justice Stewart said, well, there isn't. Or you say there isn't, he corrected himself. And you say the First Amendment must prevail and these young men must die. Is that it? And Alex Bickel said, Mr. Justice, in this instance, I'm afraid that my devotion to the First Amendment is overcome by my humanity. And he won the case with those words, in my opinion, because he showed that he was not asking the court to go crazy and just say you can publish anything. He was saying there's nothing in here that rises to that level. And that's what the court held. There's nothing in here that rises to that level.
But in some cases, it also begs the question of good motives versus justifiable ends. And the courts have to make these decisions that seem to really split hairs, because no one could envision when these 14 words were first put to paper what the circumstances would be in 2008, for instance.
Now, it seems to me you're asking me to be sorry for judges.
No, but I want you to shed a little bit more light on this, because it's an enormous responsibility to sit there on the bench and either be in the majority or the minority opinion. It's still, if they choose to hear the case, we want to know what they think.
That's the thing about being a judge. You have to tell people what you think. It's not like Congress, where you can duck and say, we're not going to take this bill up. We don't want to deal with it. Or the president, I'm not going to answer this question now. If a case is properly in the court, they have to decide it. And very often it comes down to what you said, little narrow differences, and with very large implications, and you have to decide. I speak with a sympathy for this because I have a wife who's a judge. I have sympathy for it anyway. I've reported about judges for many years. I did in the past, and I have a high opinion of judges. But you're absolutely right. There's no magic solution. Judges have to look at the text of what they're dealing with, whether it's the Constitution or a statute or what a president has said or what somebody else has said. They have to look at the circumstances. They have to look at the past. They have to look at what courts have said before them, precedents, because that's the way our courts work, from case to case. Not true in other countries, but in Anglo-American law, you go from case to case, and if an issue has been decided once, it gets decided again and again and again. and the precedents add up.
For the average person, do you think the average person has really an idea of what the First Amendment is and how it can and does affect their daily life?
You're talking about the average person who's read my book?
Oh, well, those are enlightened people, obviously, the folks that are in this room, but just general everyday
No,
people.
of course I'm just joking. No, the answer is no. We take the First Amendment and our freedoms for granted, most of us. And it's understandable, but unfortunate, because we're not grateful enough for what the framers of our Constitution and the amendments did. It's really remarkable. You know, those men, they were all men then, back in 1787 in Philadelphia. They sat in a room for 2 months and produced this Constitution that has lasted from then until now. And let's give a little credit to Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a Constitution that was written by John Adams in 1760, earlier. And it is still the Constitution of Massachusetts, amended, but it is still the Constitution of Massachusetts. Those people really had talent. They wrote for the ages, and you know, we should be grateful to them and understand what it is they've given us, which is freedom.
I marvel at the simplicity and the wisdom of these gentlemen who wrote these very profound documents. Their level of education, or lack of saying, but just their ability for common sense and really well thought out positions. And then the kind of courts and what have you today that has to try to decide what these simple words really mean as to today. For instance, we've got blogs, you have the internet, so the whole free speech, the First Amendment thing comes into play. We only had newspapers back then, and barely a lot of those.
Hardly any. Well, we had some, but they were little sheets that somebody went to a printer with a piece of foolscap, long piece of paper, on which he had written some things, and he said to the printer, "Here's my newspaper, printed." And that was a newspaper. They were very rudimentary, but they had some of the same problems we do. One paper, for example, published the first charge in a columnist, by a columnist, rogues even in their day. I was a columnist for years, in case that wasn't clear. That Thomas Jefferson had fathered a child by a slave woman, Sally Hemings. That was a columnist's charge back in around the turn of the 18th century. So, you know, they had some of the same problems. And they faced very tough odds in dealing with the government because under the Sedition Act, all the leading pro-Jefferson editors were sent to prison. And one member of Congress, who was a pro-Jefferson member of Congress, was sent to prison from Vermont, a Vermont congressman. That was a really wicked statute.
But as it turns out, that columnist was correct.
It seems so. Occasionally they're correct. You know, Chief Justice Hughes called them calumnists.
In terms of what we're looking at today, we have been called a very litigious society. We will sue you. Those are not the same pants that I brought you 2 years ago in the cleaners, and I'm going to sue you for $100 million, and I want the Supreme Court to decide this case. Every now and then, something almost gets to the court, but then the court will say, no, we're not going to hear that. Or they will say, yes, we do want to hear it.
In case you didn't recognize the allusion, there was actually a case against a cleaner for not returning the same set of pants. For how many thousands of dollars?
Millions.
Millions, crazy.
Yeah.
So,
Brought by a judge.
what? Oh, brought by a judge, yes, yes. Worse yet, ridiculous. Judges should not sue. It's an absolute rule. Well, yes, the courts have various ways of refusing to decide things. In the end, they can't escape, as I said earlier. But they can decide that a case is not ready for decision. They will not decide usually what are called abstract decisions. You can't go into court and say, I don't like something, declare it illegal. You have to have a personal interest in the case. It has to affect you personally. That gives you what's called standing. And that's not true in all societies. And in fact, in Massachusetts, we have a provision of the state constitution that allows the legislature, not like an ordinary lawsuit, to go to the Supreme Judicial Court and ask its opinion. You can ask the Supreme Judicial Court about some law you want to pass, if you can get a majority in the legislature, the great and general court, to ask it, and ask the Supreme Judicial Court, would it be constitutional if we passed this law? That's a kind of case that would not be allowed in the federal courts.
You know, some people are, I want to go back to this question about Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers and who really was Deep Throat. Deep Throat was a character that was allegedly leaking all of the information and everybody wanted to know, and the two columnists, Woodward and Bernstein, were threatened with jail, et cetera, et cetera. Do we know to this day who Deep Throat was?
Deep Throat was in Watergate, not the Pentagon
Watergate,
Papers.
I'm sorry, Watergate.
That's all right. Yes, a lot of people always wondered whether there really was a Deep Throat or whether Woodward and Bernstein had called their source, really had many sources, and decided to call one source Deep Throat because it added a sort of drama, you know, and if you saw the movie, they'd go into a garage and their Deep Throat was lurking behind a pillar. Yeah. You never saw his face. Who knows whether it's true or not? But they would never say. Then they finally did say, and nobody was really convinced. I've forgotten who it was, an ex-head of the FBI.
Say again?
Mark Bell.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yeah. And it was rather unconvincing. I don't know. They got enough right, and that was what mattered.
But, you know, it seems like the courts have always said that, you know, that they wanted to balance the interest of privacy against society's interest. And that seems to be holding pretty true today.
Well, the courts have not been very good to privacy, in my opinion. I'm a great believer in privacy. I'll give you an example of a case. As I said before, to me, the law is stories, and I like telling stories. This is a story about a family called Hill, H-I-L-L. It lived outside of Philadelphia. And one day their home was invaded by 3 escaped convicts who kept them in the house. They didn't do anything bad to the Hill family. They just wouldn't let them leave for several days. And finally the convicts left, and 2 of them were in fact killed by the police and 1 captured. And the case was a huge newspaper story in Philadelphia, and it had traumatic effects on Mrs. Hill especially. She was a very private person, and she did not was indeed traumatized by seeing her picture and her name in all the Philadelphia newspapers. Well, some years passed, and somebody wrote a play called The Desperate Hours about a family whose home is invaded by escaped convicts. And Life magazine decided to do a picture story and staged it in the home of I didn't say, the Hills left their house outside of Philadelphia to seek greater privacy and moved to a remote corner of Connecticut. But the Life staged their picture story in the former home of the Hills and treated it as though everything was the same. But in fact, in the desperate hours, the escaped criminals were nasty. They raped the daughter. They threatened the father to beat up the father, and so on. It was a different story, but Life treated it as if it were the same. And again, it had traumatic effects on Mrs. Hill. And doctors warned that she was very fragile and you didn't know what was going to happen. I found out I have to interrupt myself to say, Mr. Hill sued for invasion of his privacy under New York law. The case went to the Supreme Court of the United States, where it was argued twice. There was a change of mind inside the court, we now know. Mr. Hill was represented by Richard M. Nixon between the time he was vice president and president. He was in private practice of law in New York. He gave a very good argument, so the justices thought, but he lost the case 5-4. And the Supreme Court took away a small judgment that Mr. Hill had won, $25,000. And 2 years later, I learned from an article about the case by Nixon's law partner, Leonard Garment, Mrs. Hill committed suicide. Now, to my mind, that case was wrongly decided. I think the claim of privacy outweighed the claim of Life magazine, which was that we need to inform the public about this play. I thought that was not a terribly weighty argument. I thought the claim of privacy was stronger, but I didn't decide the case.
By comparison, there is another case where law enforcement and the public felt that they had the right to know the details. This would affect a New York Times reporter, I believe, who wrote about an 8-year-old that had been addicted to heroin.
Washington Post.
Washington Post. So what they wanted to know, it's bad when you have another reporter sitting next to you. You got to get every fact right, but that's the whole purpose of this thing.
This is such a bad story that I don't want the New York Times tarred with it.
Okay. So we'll give it to the other guys over at the Washington Post, but people felt like there was a compelling reason to know who addicted this 8-year-old boy to heroin. But as you can finish up the story, there's a lot more to it than met the eye.
A woman reporter on the Washington Post wrote this article about an 8-year-old boy named Jimmy and how he became addicted to heroin. And she didn't say who had told her about it. It was an unnamed source. And it was a very compelling story, gripping, to say the least, an 8-year-old heroin addict. And she won the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
And then the story unraveled, and it turned out she made it up. She made it up. Now, that's not good. And, of course, she lost her job and the prize, and who knows what's happened to her. It was very, very sad. It was a kind of, why would you do that? You just have to be crazy. Well, she'd have been better off if she hadn't won the Pulitzer Prize, and maybe the thing life would have gone on. But when you win the Pulitzer Prize, everybody wants to know.
Well, you won it. So, got anything you want to share with us? No. But, we've had our share of reporters who have written things and columnists who have written things. Mike Barnacle, for instance,
Oh, yes.
bounced him from the Boston Globe for lying. There were a lot of us as a reporter for WBZ Radio. We would hear Barnacle talk about places where he would go in the black community by himself, 2 o'clock in the morning, and we knew that that was not possible. You had another poet from Boston Globe who also got caught, Patricia Smith, for making up things.
She was good. I was sorry about her.
Yeah, she was terrific.
She made it up. You can't do that.
But, like the courts, I want to go back to when things are said about people and then the court is called in to decide, can they sue and where did the information come from? So with a lot of our celebrities, you have to be very careful of what you say, and it's all about intent, malice, and et cetera. So do you see that the courts are playing a greater role in deciding what can and cannot be said?
Yes, they've revolutionized in my lifetime, and I actually covered this case, and I was very close to it because it involved the New York Times, and I knew the lawyer for the New York Times very well, Professor Herbert Wexler of the Columbia Law School. The case was this. Let me tell you how it began, because libel law that allows you to get money damages for injury to your reputation, was the same in this country, or much of this country, as it was historically in England. It was unlike other kinds of damage actions. If you're hit by a car, or you claim you were hit by a car, you have to show that the driver of the car caused the injury, that the driver was negligent, and so on. In libel, you didn't have to show anything. Damage was presumed, injury was presumed, and all you had to prove was that the item had been published. And then it was up to the defendant, the publisher, the newspaper, or whoever, to prove that it was true. You didn't have to prove that it was false. The publisher had to prove that it was true, which is sometimes hard to do. Anyway, that all changed in a single case in the Supreme Court of the United States, the case of New York Times against Sullivan. The New York Times had carried an ad by supporters of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The ad appeared in 1960. Now, I want to tell you that 1960 was 6 years after the Supreme Court decided in Brown against Board of Education that you couldn't segregate school children on account of race in public schools. But 6 years later, all the universities, not just schools, but schools and universities, state universities in the Deep South, remained segregated. No black and white students in the same classrooms. That's how bad it was. And of course, in the deep parts of the Deep South, black citizens couldn't vote and so on. That's what Dr. King was trying to change. This ad said that Dr. King and his supporters had been brutally treated by supporters of segregation. It didn't name any of those supporters of segregation, the people who had carried out brutality. It just called them Southern violators of the Constitution. But one Southern official named Sullivan, a official of the city of Montgomery, Alabama, sued the New York Times, claiming that people in Montgomery would connect him with the ad and think worse of him. I may say that Justice Black, who came from Alabama when the case was decided, observed that if anybody in Montgomery, he was talking about the white people of Montgomery, Mr. Sullivan's milieu, happened to read the New York Times, which practically nobody did, and connected Mr. Sullivan with the ad, they probably would have thought better of him, not worse. That's what Justice Black said. But anyway, Mr. Sullivan won damages, all the damages he was asking for, $500,000, the largest libel judgment in Alabama history, from an all-white jury, before a judge who loved the Confederacy so much that on the anniversary of the founding of the Confederacy, he seated the jurors in his courtroom in Confederate military uniforms. Well, never before in our whole history had the Supreme Court reversed a libel judgment as in conflict with the First Amendment. It was always thought that libel was implicitly outside the protection of the First Amendment. That had been the rule from 1791 to 1964 when this case was decided. But here, libel was being used for a political purpose. It was being used to frighten the national press out of covering the civil rights movement in the South, lest they get hit with big libel judgments. And that was the purpose, and it was the effect. And the Supreme Court decided unanimously that that libel judgment could not stand. And that began a new era in which libel is scrutinized very carefully to protect free speech.
Yeah, but Justice White in another case, and I'm not going to mention the newspaper, I've got two wrong out of this tonight. I'm not going back near that. But Justice White said in one particular case that the press is far from being helpless because it has the power of communications on its side.
Justice White, I like Justice White. He was quite a very interesting and wonderful man. I think very few of you are old enough to remember him, but he was a great football player in addition to being a great intellect and a Rhodes Scholar and so on. He played in the National Football League, and he hated it. He was the press, not me, but the sort of haphazard press used to call him Whizzer White, which was his nickname as a football star. But he didn't like that. He was a judge now, and he wanted to be treated as a judge. Anyway, he didn't like the press very much. I never understood why. He must have been bitten by some story once, which is possible. It happens. And he did say that, and furthermore, he was right. The press does have its defenses. It can always whine. It's very good at whining. We can say, every time something is done that the press doesn't like, it can wrap itself in the First Amendment and say, we're being unfairly trampled on. The Constitution is being violated. And since the press is the people who tells you the news, they can talk about their own grievances at length. That's what Justice White meant, and he had a point. May I tell another story?
Please do, and then we're going to take some questions.
Well, this is a completely sort of outside story. This same Fred Friendly I mentioned earlier, Ed Murrow's producer, later on, as vice president of the Ford Foundation, started a series of community events. He'd get judges, lawyers, and journalists into a room and make up cases for them to discuss. And the journalist would play Mr. Journalist, and the judge would play Mr. Judge, and the lawyer would play Miss Lawyer, and so on. And he persuaded Justice Potter Stewart, same judge who asked the question of Alex Bickle in the Pentagon Papers case, to come to one of these. It was put on by the Washington Post. Big room full of journalists, and for some reason, the journalists that day were all feeling full of themselves, and they were denouncing judges for not deciding every case in their favor. In fact, they won about 90% of the cases, but they were angry about the other 10%. Those judges don't give us our rights, and so on. Finally, Potter Stewart couldn't stand it anymore. He had extracted a promise from Fred Friendly that he wouldn't be called on and wouldn't be expected to say anything, but he couldn't stand it. So he put up his hand and he said, "I just want to say something. You're all talking about the terrible judges who deprive you of your rights. Well, who do you think gave you those rights? The stork didn't bring them, the judges did."
And that goes right back to what we've been saying all along for this evening. It has been the interpretation of the judges that have really helped to bring us where we are. We'd like to open up this to some questions from you, the audience, and we want to thank you very much for being here. Yes, and please speak as loudly as you can.
Yes, to digress from the First Amendment for a moment. As the Constitution is being interpreted these days, do you think the current administration is upholding it?
I think in many ways, this doesn't have to do, in my view, so much with the First Amendment. But you said you weren't asking about the First Amendment. I think some of the things that have gone on have been, in the last few years, especially since 9/11, have been very dangerous and very inconsistent with the Constitution. The President has claimed the power to do things on his own without congressional authorization in ways that have never been done before. He ordered the National Security Agency to violate a criminal statute which laid down rules for wiretapping and made it a crime to violate those rules. He ordered the National Security Agency to violate those rules and wiretap Americans, when he could have asked Congress, and Congress, in my judgment, would easily have given him the authority he wanted, but he wanted to do it on his own. And he's done that again and again, claiming sole power in the presidency, which is very dangerous because the whole theory of our Constitution, the main theory at the Convention of 1787 was that we would have 3 branches of government to prevent abuse of power. If one branch overreached, then another would stop it. That was the theory of the Constitution. It wasn't a single power, it was 3 heads of power checking each other. So that's very dangerous. I'm also very alarmed by the torture of detainees. I think it's terrible that a president of the United States has claimed the power to torture people who are detained. Doesn't matter how bad they are. They haven't actually been charged with anything, most of them. They certainly haven't been tried. There's been no proof of anything. Maybe most of them are bad guys, but we've returned hundreds of them, so some of them at least were not bad guys. And to torture people is really awful. It's something that I grew up thinking was unimaginable that the United States government would do. That's enough of an answer.
Question here.
That really answers the
Yes.
question.
Do you think it amounts to prior restraints to have the NSA seemingly listening to a lot of telephone calls and having libraries expected to divulge information? Don't people in effect restrain themselves from saying things because of the, even if it's not real, the illusion that everything is being watched?
Those are 2 different things. I don't think either is exactly, in technical terms, a prior restraint. But the effect will be to discourage free speech, exactly as you say. The library thing is very worrying. You know, the Patriot Act gave the FBI power on its own say-so, with no judicial review, no order from any judge, to type up a national security letter, any FBI agent, a national security letter, present it to a librarian, and demand to know what books X or Y any one of you is reading. And the librarian was forbidden by the law to tell anybody about it, or go to court, or do anything except answer the question, or else be put in jail for not answering the question. I think it was outrageous. It's been somewhat amended more recently so that now you can go to court, and the FBI has backed off in a couple of cases. You know, if you have a way of challenging something, then the government sometimes has to admit it's wrong. That's why we have challenges. The wiretapping case, it's very hard. There's a dilemma about going to court over the wiretapping because it's all secret. And in order to go to court, you have to show injury, as I said earlier. And you can't, you know, you go to court and say, I think my phone is being tapped. But how do you know? You can't prove it. And the court says, sorry, you don't have standing. It's done that in most cases.
Yes.
Question concerning early life.
To Mr. Romney or the daily newspaper.
Is really leading to another point also, because whoever the new administration is, it's not just the Supreme Court, but it's all the federal courts.
Oh, yes.
And things where stuff has to percolate up to get to that point. So there are some enormous weights pending with this. Last question, sure.
Do you think it would be better if the Supreme Court judges were elected rather than just appointed by the president?
No, I don't think so. We have an example now in state courts. In the past, most state courts, unlike ours, the judges are elected. In Massachusetts and maybe 5 other states at most, judges are all appointed by the governor and with the consent in Massachusetts of the governor's council. In recent years, economic interests have taken a very great part in the elections. The elections used to be just pro forma. Nobody cared, and sitting judges were reelected and so on. In recent years, especially companies worried about damages in tort cases, asbestos, tobacco, have tried to put on state courts judges who will decide in their favor and not allow punitive damages and so on and so on. And the costs of the campaign have gone up into the millions. A judge running for re-election in Texas, a Supreme Court justice in Texas running for election, may have to raise $5 or $6 million. Now, where do you think he gets the money from? Who do you think contributes? Lawyers. And here's a lawyer appears in court before the judge, Your Honor, under his breath, I gave you $100,000. It's not good.
Well, you know, one of the purposes for, and I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out. This has been an excellent gathering of people who are interested in the good thought process. And the reason why we're all here is because Mr. Anthony Lewis has written his latest publication, which is Freedom of Biography of the First Amendment. We want to ask you please to stay with us a few minutes. Your books are available for folks who'd like to take part. The price is reasonable, and perhaps you'd be willing to
Of
also
course.
sign a few. How about a round of applause for our guests? We are extremely grateful to have people of your caliber and your accomplishments to come out here. We've had a good cast of folks. You've certainly brought a lot to our group this evening, and we're very appreciative of that.
I want to say thank you to you because I really meant what I said about public libraries and their place in the community, and it's obvious that this one has an important place, and I really am grateful.
Well, I need you to tell the story just briefly, if you would. You were at one of the national television networks or something to talk.
Oh, yeah.
You got to share this.
I said to Mr. Lewis before we came in here that he asked me some questions, and he was obviously very familiar with my book, and I said it's a little different from some other occasions. My last book, 17 years ago, I went on the Today Show to talk about it, and I was propelled into a seat on this set, and there was a sign that said 5 seconds, 4 seconds, and a young woman came in and sat opposite me, and just before the minutes were up, the seconds were up, she said, I'm terribly sorry, I haven't had a chance to read your book.
But then she opened it up by saying,
And then she started off by saying, wisely, Mr. Lewis, she looked very wise, you know, she said, Mr. Lewis, tell us about your book.